18 engineers failed, but the receptionist solved everything in 1 minute, and the CEO's reaction shocked everyone. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The office lights at Preston and Locke were still glowing when Madeline Carter arrived for her usual late shift. The sleek building, with its glass facade and solar panels, stood like a beacon against the evening skyline of downtown Chicago. As she passed through the lobby, the receptionist offered a weary smile. Another late meeting upstairs. The Green Horizon team doesn't know when to quit. Madeline returned the smile, retrieved the service card, and headed to the 3rd floor, where the executive conference rooms were located. Her job as a flexible support staffer involved prepping meeting spaces, keeping things orderly, serving refreshments, and handling the little details that made long strategy sessions more bearable. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her access to nearly every part of the company, one of the leading firms in sustainable architecture across the country. Madeline had always been drawn to architecture. She'd started college with plans to become a licensed architect, but life interrupted when her mother became seriously ill. Forced to pause her studies, she'd taken on full-time work to support herself and her younger brother, Logan. Still, her passion for the field hadn't faded. Their small apartment was crowded with textbooks, architecture magazines, and printed articles on green construction. Every time she walked through the design floors at Preston and Locke and caught sight of models, drawings, and renderings penned across boards, the desire to one day be part of that creative process stirred again inside her. That night, there was a clear tension in the air. The main conference room was filled with the firm's most senior architects and engineers. On the large screen, complex graphs and layered schematics outlined a proposal known as the Green Horizon Initiative, a high-stakes eco-development project for a new residential district on the outskirts of Chicago, backed by both government and private funds. But things weren't going well. For days, the team had been unable to finalize the energy feasibility model. Frustration had built up, and whispers circulated that CEO Miles Prescott might pull the plug altogether if they didn't present a viable path forward. Madeline entered quietly, as she always did. She set down trays of coffee and sparkling water, replaced empty pitchers, and adjusted the placement of chairs. As she moved through the room, snatches of conversation reached her ears. "We still can't balance the load flows," muttered one engineer. "The thermal simulations don't match projected outcomes," added another. 18 experts and no resolution? Barked a commanding voice. Even without seeing him, Madeline recognized the sharp tone of Miles Prescott. She didn't need to look up to know he was there. The air around him always seemed charged. When the group finally stepped out for a short break, Madeline remained in the room alone. The screen still displayed the unresolved data, drawn by instinct more than intention. She approached the whiteboard cluttered with hastily scribbled equations and notes. She read through the mess, frowning slightly, then picked up a marker and made a subtle correction, streamlining a formula with a cleaner substitution. She added a small side note: recheck absorption rate correlations. It was barely more than a suggestion. She didn't dwell on it, just set the marker back down and resumed arranging the serving table as she heard the footsteps returning. What Madeline didn't know was that Miles Prescott had been watching from the doorway. Tall, impeccably dressed, and known for his no-nonsense demeanor, he was someone people rarely questioned. But as he observed the change she made, reflected in the glass wall beside her, something caught his attention. No one in the team had thought of that angle. As the others settled back in, he moved straight to the whiteboard. He stared at the fresh line of ink for a long second. Then, turning to his team, he said flatly, "Run this variable. Right now." Confused glances were exchanged, but no one argued. 10 minutes later, the first graph aligned. Then, the next. For the first time in days, a coherent pattern started to emerge. A wave of disbelief passed through the room. Who did that? Someone asked aloud. Silence. But Miles already had the answer. He left the room, crossed the hallway, and spotted Madeline at the kitchenette, wiping down a countertop. He approached without hesitation. Did you change the formula? He asked. She froze. Turning slowly, she replied, I just glanced at it. It looked more complicated than it needed to be. He studied her for a moment. There was no arrogance in her tone, only honesty. And that, in his world, was rare. What's your background? He asked. Architecture? 2 years. Had to stop, she said plainly. He stood there quietly for a beat, then said, Tomorrow. 9 a.m. I want you in the technical review meeting. She blinked, startled. But I'm just support staff. He gave a small nod and turned away. Tomorrow, you're more than that. Madeline remained frozen in the hallway, cleaning cloth still in hand, heart pounding. She didn't quite understand what had just happened, but something had shifted, and she could feel it. The next morning, Madeline Carter arrived at the Preston and Walk building earlier than usual. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her brown hair was pulled back into a neat, understated bun. Her name badge still reads Support Services. And out of habit, she rolled the service cart toward the executive floor. But before she could begin her usual tasks, she was intercepted by Brandon Lee, the company's technical director and one of Miles Prescott's most trusted associates. Madeline, Mr. Prescott asked that you go straight to the project room. He specifically requested your presence. With a brief nod, she left the cart in the staff kitchen and walked down the corridor toward the main conference space. The room was already filled with senior engineers and architects, many of whom turned to look at her with curiosity tinged with skepticism. At the front of the room, standing near the large projection screen, was Miles Prescott himself. Miss Carter, come forward, he said, his tone even and direct. She took a steady breath and approached. Last night, you made a correction that unlocked a critical part of our model. I'd like you to explain to the team how you reached that solution. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a directive. Madeline scanned the room, aware that most of the people present had decades of experience and prestigious degrees, credentials that far outweighed her incomplete college education. Still, she held her ground. Well, sir, I don't have the same academic background you all do. But when I looked at the data, the calculations seemed unnecessarily tangled. The correlation between absorption rate and facade orientation wasn't being fully leveraged. I just saw a way to simplify it. She walked to the screen, pointed at several sections of the diagram, and explained her line of reasoning in a clear, straightforward way. The room fell into a heavy silence. Then one of the senior engineers, Mark Douglas, crossed his arms and spoke with unexpected respect. Simple and effective. Another murmured, that's what was blocking the iteration. Miles hadn't looked away once. There was no trace of condescension in his expression-only focus. He listened intently to every word she said, analyzing not just what she said, but how she said it. At the close of the meeting, Miles spoke again calmly, but with weight. As of today, Miss Carter will be joining the Green Horizon team sessions. Not as support staff, but as a junior analyst. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Madeline instinctively raised a hand, uncertain. But sir, my position will be reassigned. HR will be informed. I want your insight in the next development phase, he said, already turning to leave. Madeline remained where she was, stunned, the cleaning cloth still in her hand. Something had shifted. The room behind her buzzed with quiet speculation. As she walked out in the hallways, the look she received had changed. People who never gave her a second glance now seemed to study her as she passed. Some approached with polite congratulations. Others offered vague nods that hinted at doubt. Madeline knew she'd have to prove herself quickly. That afternoon, during a short break in the employee cafe, she sat across from Sophie Bennett, a front desk colleague and one of the few people she trusted at work. "Did you hear? Prescott praised you in front of the entire team," Sophie said, eyes wide. Madeline replied with a modest smile. "I don't know if it was praise or a challenge. But either way, I'm going to show him I belong at that table." They held one more surprise. Before she clocked out, Brandon approached her again. "Miss Carter, Mr. Prescott would like you to attend tonight's informal dinner with the international partners. Don't stress about the dress code. It's just a relaxed gathering at North Shore Social." Madeline barely had time to think. She rushed home, sorted through her limited wardrobe, and with Logan's help, pieced together an outfit that was clean, modest, and just polished enough to pass for semi-formal. The restaurant had a relaxed ambience, but the guest list was far from casual. Renowned architects, investors, and even a representative from the city's planning board filled the tables. Madeline kept to herself, listening far more than she spoke. But as the evening unfolded, Miles called on her to share her opinion on the integrated solar panel structures. She responded calmly, outlining her thoughts without hesitation. The clarity in her voice and the logic of her ideas caught more than one person's attention. By the end of the night, a visiting architect leaned toward Miles and said with a grin, "Mr. Prescott, you've got some hidden gems on your team." Madeline offered a polite nod. Miles didn't respond, but his gaze lingered longer than usual. That night, back at the apartment, Madeline found Logan still awake, reviewing materials for an upcoming scholarship exam. She joined him on the couch and recounted the evening's events, pausing between moments, still unsure if everything had really happened. As she spoke, one thought kept circling in her mind. Sometimes, life cracked open in the least expected places, and when it did, you had to be brave enough to step through the opening. In the weeks that followed the dinner at North Shore Social, Madeline Carter's routine transformed. No longer confined to support duties, she now moved freely through the upper floors of Preston and Locke, where the company's most strategic meetings took place. Her new title, officially listed as Junior Analyst for the Green Horizon Initiative, had been formalized by Brandon Lee. He'd arranged for her to receive a company laptop, limited access to technical documents, and a discreet desk alongside. The project team. It wasn't a promotion in the traditional sense, but it was a step and a visible one. Some colleagues treated her with newfound respect. Others were curious. And inevitably, there were those who viewed her sudden advancement with barely veiled discomfort. Madeline stayed focused. She spent hours studying formulas, learning new modeling software, and reviewing case studies on sustainable urban planning. At home, Logan followed her progress with excitement. "You're good at this, Maddie. Don't let anyone make you doubt it." Between long days at the firm and late nights of research, she felt something shift inside her. She was picking up a thread she thought she'd lost years ago. But deep down, she knew she needed more. The 2 years of college she had completed before her mother fell ill hadn't given her a diploma. And while the door Miles Prescott had opened gave her access, a proper education was what would help her truly belong in that world. One night, while browsing education resources, Madeline found a link that made her heart race. Westbrook School of Sustainable Architecture had just opened applications for a re-entry program with full scholarships for students with interrupted academic histories. The program was tailored for cases like hers, talented individuals who had been forced to step away due to personal or financial hardship. The degree offered a full curriculum in architecture with a focus on green cities and adaptive reuse. And it allowed flexible scheduling for working professionals. She didn't hesitate. She wrote a thorough application, attached her transcript, a heartfelt personal essay, and even a letter of support from Brandon. When she hit submit, her fingers trembled and her heart pounded in her chest. Meanwhile, the Green Horizon team entered a critical phase. They were preparing to unveil a new energy-positive building design at an international architecture conference in San Diego. Miles Prescott was personally overseeing every detail. Madeline was asked to join the prep team meetings, much to the curiosity of others. She's attending director-level briefings now? What role is she playing in the conference? She chose not to engage in office whispers. She kept her head down, completed her assignments, and absorbed as much information as she could. The turning point came one afternoon during a full simulation of the upcoming presentation. A critical error in the energy model was detected. The orientation settings for the solar grid were misaligned, throwing off the entire balance of the system. Brandon was scrambling to troubleshoot, but the clock was ticking. Madeline, standing quietly near the back, leaned in to examine the data. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. Some eyes rolled. Others ignored her. But Miles nodded once, giving her permission to speak. She walked to the screen and calmly explained the flaw and how a slight adjustment in the angle calculations would stabilize the results. Brandon entered the revision. The model updated and held dot in the next meeting. Miles addressed the room with calm authority. "Without Miss Carter's observation, we would have lost days of progress. She will be joining us in San Diego." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction. Madeline felt a jolt in her chest, but answered clearly, "I'd be honored." The news spread fast. The former support assistant was now part of the senior team representing Preston and Locke at one of the largest industry events in North America. At home, when she told Logan and their mother, they could hardly believe it. "San Diego? That's incredible, Maddie." But with the excitement came a quiet anxiety. While the company would cover expenses, Madeline didn't even own a proper suitcase, much less attire for professional panels and networking events. That's when Sophie Bennett stepped in with a soft smile and a dress she'd worn once to a wedding. "It's simple, elegant, and it fits you. Take it. You'll feel confident." The night before the trip, a message arrived in Madeline's inbox. Her application had advanced. Subject: Final interview invitation, Westbrook Scholarship Program. Her breath caught. Her hand shook slightly as she reread the confirmation. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't turning back. San Diego wasn't just a business trip. It was a threshold. And she was ready to cross it, step by uncertain step, building the life she thought she'd lost, but had just begun to reclaim. The trip to San Diego began under a cloudy sky, but inside the high-speed train, Madeline Carter kept her eyes fixed on the folder of documents resting on her lap. It was her first time attending an international architecture conference, and, even more incredible, she was doing so as part of the senior team from Preston and Locke. The Green Horizon Initiative had booked 2 private cars. Laptops were open. Presentations were being tweaked, and technical conversations filled the space. Madeline, dressed in the outfit Sophie had lent her, watched every interaction carefully, absorbing the atmosphere like oxygen. Miles Prescott and Brandon Lee had seamlessly included her in the group's discussions. While some of the more senior staff still eyed her with a hint of skepticism, Madeline didn't let it rattle her. She knew why she was there, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. By the time the train pulled into the city that evening, the weather had cleared. At the hotel arranged by the event committee, Madeline messaged Sophie, who, sensing her anxiety, replied, "Trust yourself. You're more prepared than you think." The first day of the conference was filled with lectures by some of the world's most prominent voices in sustainable architecture. The ballrooms of the San Diego Convention Center were packed. Wearing Her badge and holding her notebook tight, Madeline followed each keynote with intense focus. Experts from across the globe, professors, researchers, and innovators filled the hallways. During a break, she spotted one of the scholarship panelists she'd researched. The sight made her chest tighten, but she didn't flinch. She straightened her back and stayed composed. That afternoon, the Preston and Locke team had a brief technical rehearsal in the main presentation hall. As always, last-minute glitches surfaced. A data inconsistency in the energy model threatened to throw off the graphs. While the team scrambled to troubleshoot, Madeline quietly reviewed the codebase and spotted a duplicated variable that was corrupting the data set. She walked over to Brandon and pointed it out. He checked and confirmed it instantly. "Good catch. You just saved us a major headache tomorrow." He said it loud enough for others to hear. Even Miles glanced over and gave her a short nod. That night, over dinner at the hotel's restaurant, something had shifted. The energy at the table was more relaxed, the tone among the team lighter. For the first time, Madeline felt she wasn't just tolerated, she was accepted. Brandon leaned closer during a meal and said quietly, "You've got an eye for things most people miss. That's rare." It wasn't just a compliment, it was validation. And it stayed with her. The next day, the presentation room buzzed with energy. It was the biggest crowd Madeline had ever seen at a professional event. Executives, scholars, students, journalists. She sat in the third row next to the team, wearing the same elegant dress Sophie had pressed into her hands. Miles and Brandon took the stage, leading the showcase, but the materials they were presenting had been shaped significantly by Madeline's input. She recognized every term, every data point. As the 3D model of the energy-positive building spun on screen and performance metrics lit up, a surge of pride filled her chest. The presentation flowed effortlessly. The applause at the end was thunderous. Several attendees approached the team afterward, including one who specifically asked to speak with the young analyst who resolved the calculation issue. Later that day, another surprise caught her off guard. At the booth for Architects Review, the most influential design journal in the country, a reporter came over to gather quotes about Preston and Locke's participation. After Brandon casually mentioned that much of the project's success was thanks to the contributions of a new team member, the journalist asked to meet Madeline. The interview was short but warm. As the reporter walked away, Brandon turned to her with a smile. "Get ready. Your name's about to get around." That afternoon, walking through the exhibition floor among researchers from around the world, Madeline felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not nerves, not intimidation, but belonging. She listened in on conversations and realized she understood. She was ready. This wasn't a fluke. This was effort, showing its face. She wasn't on the outside anymore. She was becoming part of something real. Back at the hotel that evening, a new email pinned in her inbox. It wasn't just a reminder for the scholarship interview, it contained the final assignment, a detailed brief for an original project proposal. It was the last stage of the selection process. She had under 2 weeks to deliver a fully developed concept. Sitting on the edge of the bed with her laptop, she started sketching ideas. Her mind buzzed. Balancing this with work would be a challenge, especially after the success of San Diego surely raised expectations. But quitting wasn't an option. When Sophie called via video and saw her hunched over a mess of notes and diagrams, she laughed. Softly, "Talk tomorrow. Right now, you've got a new mountain to climb." And so, surrounded by notes, code, and caffeine, Madeline Carter took another step on the path she was quietly, fearlessly paving. The success of Preston and Locke's presentation at the International Conference on Sustainable Architecture continued to ripple through the halls of the San Diego Convention Center the next morning. The booths were buzzing and the breakout sessions remained packed, but Madeline Carter now felt a distinct shift in the way people looked at her. No longer just a former receptionist or temporary assistant, she had become someone whose insight had helped correct a critical flaw in the energy model. Someone who had earned her seat at the table. In the corridors, colleagues and even professionals from other firms stopped her naturally, asking for her opinion on panels or referencing the team's work the day before. Madeline did her best to stay composed, though internally, a storm of nerves and excitement stirred. At the back of her mind, a quiet pressure persisted. The original design proposal she needed to develop for the final stage of her scholarship application. Between sessions, she found corners to jot down concepts in the notebook she kept close. The deadline was tight, and with her rising visibility at work, balancing both commitments would be no small feat. On the third day, the conference took on a more relaxed rhythm. During a lunch hosted by the event committee for the attending teams, Madeline was seated at a table alongside delegates from Germany and professors from Scandinavian universities. Brandon, always intuitive, nudged her gently to join the conversation. When the topic shifted to urban spaces built for climate resilience, Madeline spoke up. She mentioned passive airflow systems in densely built areas and the importance of designing microclimates within cities. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply shared what years of reading, observation, and passion had taught her. Yet the others around the table listened carefully, engaging with respect. Across the room, Miles Prescott observed it all. Silently, he watched the way she spoke, calm, confident, never arrogant. And in that moment, it became clear to him, Madeline didn't just belong in that room. She added something to it that others couldn't. That evening, the Preston and Locke team was invited to a formal dinner at a restaurant overlooking the marina. The invitation had initially made Madeline hesitate, but Brandon and Sophie had both encouraged her to attend. She knew the value of being present in those circles. Wearing again the elegant dress Sophie had packed for her, she joined the team on the rooftop terrace. The air was warm, the lights from the boats casting soft reflections on the water. Throughout the evening, Madeline was introduced to well-known architects, researchers, and firm directors. They asked about her background, her role, and her interest in sustainable design. And with each answer, she realized that people were actually listening. Her words carried weight. Her perspective mattered. Miles, ever reserved, remained on the periphery, but whenever their eyes met, there was an unmistakable mutual understanding. No need for praise or speeches. Just respect. Later that night, as guests lingered on the terrace, enjoying the view and casual conversations, Madeline stepped aside. She needed a moment to breathe, to collect her thoughts. The pressure of being noticed, of becoming more visible, was exhilarating, but it was also daunting. And looming above it all was the scholarship project, the key to securing her future. As she stood alone, arms crossed, staring out at the harbor, she heard footsteps. Miles came to stand beside her, his gaze on the skyline. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then, without preamble, he said, "You've shown a level of preparation most didn't expect." Madeline turned to him and replied simply, "Most people don't get the chance to prove what they know. When the chance comes, you take it." He nodded slowly. That was it. No long exchange. Just a shift, subtle but unmistakable. Something had changed between them. Something real. The ride back to the hotel was filled with laughter and conversation. Brandon and others were already speculating about new partnerships and potential follow-up meetings. Madeline sat quietly, absorbing it all. Her body was tired, her mind buzzing. She knew she couldn't lose sight of her design proposal. It was the next big leap. Once at the hotel, she headed straight to her room. With barely a pause, she opened her laptop, spread her notebook across the desk, and began outlining her ideas. Her head throbbed, and her eyes stung from exhaustion. But her determination was louder than the fatigue. She would need focus, clarity, and a plan. There was no room for hesitation. As the night deepened and the city quieted beyond her window, Madeline kept typing, sketching, researching. One reference led to another. Every idea was tested and reshaped. She wasn't just working for a grade or a job offer. She was building something of her own. The days in San Diego had been more than a professional milestone. They marked a turning point, not just for how others saw her, but for how she saw herself. Her future in architecture wasn't just a possibility. It was a path she was now walking, with intent, with skill, and with the conviction that she had every right to be there. The return to Chicago carried with it a physical exhaustion that contrasted sharply with the mental energy Madeline Carter felt pulsing inside her. The days spent at the San Diego conference had left a deep impression. Fresh perspectives, valuable connections, and most importantly, a growing certainty that she could, in fact, contribute meaningfully to a field that once felt unreachable. On the train ride back, while most of the team relaxed or chatted about potential collaborations, Madeline kept her eyes on her notebook. She was outlining ideas for the personal design project required for her scholarship interview. Between notes on ecological materials and structural strategies, a clear concept was beginning to form. Seated beside her, Brandon occasionally glanced at her scribbling and eventually asked, "You're really not going to take a break?" She smiled. Without looking up, "I know myself. If I stop now, I'll lose momentum." He didn't push. He understood that this wasn't just a task for her. It was a chance to reclaim a future she had once put on hold. Back in the office, things picked up quickly. The positive exposure Preston and Locke had received at the conference had created new interest in the Green Horizon Initiative, and the team was suddenly fielding proposals, meeting requests, and strategy sessions almost daily. Miles Prescott took a more active role, calling frequent meetings with clients, city planners, and even university partners. Madeline, now officially embedded in the team, was invited to sit in on nearly all of them. Any initial awkwardness her presence had caused was now replaced by quiet respect. She split her days between assisting on live projects and refining the details of her scholarship proposal. At night, she continued researching, writing, and diagramming with renewed intensity. Logan, recognizing his sister's drive, supported her in small but meaningful ways, preparing dinner, managing errands, giving her space. "You're going to get this, Maddie. I believe it," he'd say, and it always landed just right. Like a steadying hand on her back when she most needed one. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning that something shifted subtly between Madeline and Miles. The team had gathered to discuss a new adaptive housing concept for high-density neighborhoods. She sat beside Brandon, quietly taking notes, when a debate arose about modular facades for buildings in unpredictable climates. Madeline raised her hand, waited for acknowledgement, and presented a suggestion based on recent Canadian university studies. Her explanation was precise, well-supported, and clearly thought through. The room went still for a beat. Then Miles leaned slightly forward, his tone measured but certain. "That's a solid angle. I'd like you to lead that portion of the study." Coming from him, those words carried weight. But more than that, the look he gave her said something unspoken. It wasn't just professional affirmation, it was personal respect, a recognition that went beyond titles or formalities. Over the following weeks, the rhythm intensified. But so did the ease between Madeline and Miles. In the brief pauses between meetings or during coffee breaks in the lounge, their conversations began to stretch beyond work. They spoke of architectural exhibitions, sustainability trends, even books they had both read. The tone was always professional, but relaxed. And with each exchange, a new layer of connection formed. Madeline noticed that Miles, once so restrained and distant, now seemed quietly intrigued. His gaze lingered a little longer. His comments, though still concise, carried a warmth she hadn't noticed before. And within herself, Madeline began to feel something she hadn't expected, a pull that went beyond admiration. It wasn't the romance, not yet, but it was a connection built on understanding, timing, and mutual admiration. Back home, balancing the demands of the job and the looming scholarship interview began to stretch her thin. The submission deadline crept closer with each passing day. The nights grew longer. Often, Logan would wake in the middle of the night and find her at the dining table, surrounded by books, sketches, and glowing laptop screens. "You're gonna fry your brain," he'd joke, walking past with a glass of water. She'd only chuckle and keep going. She couldn't afford to slow down. Her project, focused on sustainable housing for urban density, was finally taking shape. But she wanted more than just good enough. She wanted it to stand out, to mean something, to prove she deserved that seat at the university. One Friday afternoon, while adjusting environmental metrics and polishing her floor plan in the design lab, Madeline realized how much time had slipped by. The entire week had been a blur of project deadlines, design meetings, and late-night scholarship work. As she gathered her things to leave, she passed through the lobby and unexpectedly ran into Miles. He took one look at her tired expression and said gently, "You've been pushing yourself hard." She nodded and replied with a sigh, "The scholarship interview is next week. I just want the project to feel complete, to really reflect what I can do." He paused for a second before responding, "I'm sure it will. And if there's anything you need, anything, I'm around." The words were simple, but his tone carried weight. Madeline walked out with those words echoing in her head. Amid all the stress and pressure, they brought comfort. Because someone she respected, someone who rarely said anything unless he meant it, had noticed her effort. And that mattered more than she could admit aloud. The week of the interview arrived with an even more intense pace for Madeline Carter. During the day, the demands at Preston and Locke multiplied as the Chicago office began outlining a new large-scale sustainable housing initiative. By late afternoon, and into the long evenings, her focus shifted entirely toward refining and defending the personal project she would present to the Westbrook Scholarship Board. In the small apartment she shared with her brother, the scene was always the same. Textbooks open on sustainable architecture, hand-drawn sketches spread across the dining table, and her laptop aglow with updated diagrams and adjusted notes. Logan, ever supportive, took on more of the housework and cooked simple dinners to give Madeline the space and time she needed. "You've got this, Maddie," he'd say any time he noticed fatigue or self-doubt creeping in. With each passing day, her presentation took on a sharper shape, a vision for the redesign of neglected urban neighborhoods with natural ventilation, renewable energy solutions, and community-integrated green spaces. It wasn't just an architectural concept, it was her story translated into structure and purpose, dotted Preston and Locke. The shift in Madeline's standing was becoming evident. She was now a regular voice in Green Horizon team meetings and frequently invited to internal sessions with executive leadership. The whispers of speculation that once followed her had largely faded, replaced by an atmosphere of growing respect. Miles Prescott continued to pay close attention to her evolution. He would often pause to ask her thoughts on complex issues or listen intently when she offered input on new ideas. His interest was measured, professional, but also quietly consistent. Brandon, now a close ally in the office, had picked up on it too. One afternoon between meetings, he nudged her with a playful comment. "I think our boss has a new favorite consultant." Madeline had only smiled in response. She didn't know what to make of Miles's attention, but there was no denying it carried more meaning each time. It felt mutual, something unspoken, steady, and quietly growing between lines. of data and strategy. The day of the interview came faster than she expected. Madeline woke before her alarm, took her time getting ready, and chose an outfit that felt strong and professional. She reviewed her presentation slides once more, checking every data point and design note. Before she left, Logan pulled her into a tight hug and whispered, "Make them see what I see." The Westbrook School was just a short commute from the city center. On the subway, her nerves buzzed, but she centered herself by mentally replaying her opening lines and transitions. She knew her work. She knew her story. The only unknown now was how it would be received by a board of seasoned professors and field experts. At the admissions center, she found a small waiting room where several other candidates sat, each with backgrounds as unconventional as hers. When her name was finally called, Madeline entered the room with steady steps. She greeted the panel, set up her presentation, and launched into her pitch. For 30 minutes, she spoke with clarity, conviction, and depth, laying out her plan for sustainable revitalization of underserved neighborhoods. Her words weren't just technical, they carried heart, purpose, and vision. When she finished, the panel began their questions, direct, detailed. Madeline answered confidently. There was no room for hesitation. Every response strengthened the impression she was building, not just as a capable candidate, but as someone already deeply rooted in the mission of sustainable architecture. When the final thank you came, she exhaled and stepped out of the room with a rush of relief. In the hallway, she sat for a few minutes on a bench, letting her heartbeat settle. The pressure of the past weeks lifted slightly, and she allowed herself the smallest moment of pride. Back at the office that afternoon, walking through the glass doors of Preston and Locke, she felt lighter, like she had just crossed a threshold. As she passed through reception, she spotted Miles finishing a conversation with a client. He saw her, broke off quickly, and approached. "How did it go?" he asked plainly. Madeline gave him a tired smile. "I think I showed them who I am. Now I wait." He met her eyes with calm certainty. "I don't doubt it for a second." And in that moment, she felt it again. Whatever this was between them, it was growing in tandem with her path. Quiet, steady, undeniable. In the days that followed, the wait for the scholarship results became just one part of a larger rhythm. The new project at Preston and Locke demanded full engagement, and Madeline threw herself into it with determination. From feasibility studies to material testing and design feasibility meetings, she worked diligently, keeping her mind occupied while her future hung in the balance. At night, she'd debrief with Logan over quick dinners, sharing updates on the firm's projects and discussing trends in green building standards. But behind all of it, she carried an inner current of anticipation. Not just about the scholarship, but about how much her life had shifted, about how things with Miles were evolving, about the unspoken familiarity now woven into their conversations. They weren't confined to project deadlines or reports anymore. They talked about cities, ideas, family, future. His gestures, small, thoughtful, became more frequent. A coffee left on her desk. A late email with a link to an article she'd mentioned in passing. None of it loud, but all of it unmistakable. She didn't know what would come of any of it, neither the scholarship nor the growing sense of something personal between them. But as she checked her inbox obsessively and walked the polished hallways of the firm each day, one truth echoed clearly in her mind. This was the world where she belonged. Here, in the steady buzz of ideas and ambition, in the tension between uncertainty and hope, this was where she wanted to keep building something real. For her career, for her future, and maybe for something more than that. On Monday morning, while reviewing a performance report on energy efficiency in one of the Preston and Locke project rooms, Madeline heard the familiar ping of a new message arriving in her personal email. She opened the tab without much thought, but the moment she saw the sender, her pulse quickened. It was from the scholarship committee. The subject line was clear: final decision of the selection process. For a few seconds, she stared at the screen. Then, with one deep breath, she clicked. Her eyes raced through the first lines until they landed on the sentence that made her breath catch. She had been accepted. Westbrook School of Sustainable Architecture was welcoming her into their sustainable design program, with a full scholarship and class schedule compatible with her job. That confirmation hit harder than she expected. Every long night, every sacrificed weekend, every worry had been worth it. She stood up, walked to the hallway, trying to steady her breathing. It wasn't the kind of moment she wanted to cry about. In front of the teen dot later that day, during lunch break, she texted Sophie, who replied almost instantly, "Told you." There was no way they were going to pass on you. In the late afternoon, she shared the news with Brandon, who gave her a broad grin and said, "You totally earned this." When Miles heard about it, his reaction was more reserved but no less sincere. They crossed paths near one of the meeting rooms, and he paused, locking eyes with her. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. The words weren't rehearsed or embellished. They felt direct, genuine, and in that moment, they meant more to her than any official statement. His expression carried the kind of quiet recognition that didn't need further explanation. A new chapter had begun, and with it came a shift in everything around her. The weeks that followed brought a pace even more intense than before. Her mornings were fully dedicated to work at Preston and Locke. She sat in on strategy meetings for the Green Horizon Initiative, reviewed plans, contributed to technical evaluations. At night, her time was taken over by lectures and assignments from Westbrook. There wasn't room for distraction. Every day was a test of focus and stamina. But Madeline pushed through with unwavering determination. Logan, always attentive, made sure the house was stocked with groceries, handled most of the cooking, and kept the place in order so she could stay on track. "You're glowing," he told her one night while she proofread a case study at the kitchen table. And he was right. Something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, she felt her path was aligned with what she wanted. And she was ready to go all in at Preston and Locke. People had started noticing her more, not just because of her ideas, but because of how she carried herself. Her growing expertise, her calm under pressure, and the way she engaged during discussions set her apart. With Miles, something unspoken had begun to take shape. There were no obvious signs, just subtle shifts. He listened more carefully when she spoke. He asked for her thoughts in meetings where she hadn't expected to be involved. And occasionally, their conversations lingered longer than necessary, as if neither of them was ready to walk away. Madeline picked up on these things. They stirred a quiet restlessness in her. This wasn't just professional appreciation. It was something gentler, something more personal. She wasn't naming it yet, but she felt it growing. One of those late afternoons, as they wrapped up a project review for a sustainable neighborhood initiative outside Chicago, that underlying tension became more visible. The office had emptied. Only the two of them remained, seated across from each other with papers and drafts spread out. When they finished, Miles leaned back in his chair and looked at her differently. "You've changed how this team works," he said. No trace of pretense. Madeline paused, unsure how to answer. She gave a soft smile. "I'm just trying to keep up and learn everything I can." He didn't look away. "You're doing a lot more than that." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It had weight. It carried meaning neither of them dared to defy. She gathered her things and thanked him. "I'll take a look at the notes again tonight." He nodded once. When she stepped into the hallway, her heart was beating faster than usual. That moment had altered something. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew it wasn't just about work anymore. The following nights were filled with readings, presentations, and planning meetings. But every now and then, her mind would drift back to that exchange. The way he had spoken, the way he had looked at her. It wasn't exaggeration or imagination. It had happened, and it unsettled her. She didn't want to assume anything, didn't want to create expectations that would lead nowhere. But something had changed between them. The pace of her life kept her grounded. There was always another deadline, another review, another lecture. But each morning, when she walked into Preston and Locke and caught a glimpse of Miles, her pulse shifted ever so slightly. She didn't talk about it with anyone, but the truth stayed with her, quietly present. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was just beginning to show. With the official start of classes at Westbrook School of Sustainable Architecture, Madeline had to completely overhaul her routine. Her days became a precise sequence of responsibilities, handled with almost mathematical discipline. In the mornings and afternoons, she reported punctually to Preston and Locke, where she remained an integral part of the Green Horizon Initiative's technical team. She participated in weekly reviews, helped select sustainable materials for a new urban center proposal, and submitted technical reports with a level of detail that didn't go unnoticed. At the end of each workday, she grabbed her pre-packed backpack and headed straight to Westbrook. Classes began in the early evening and ran until around 10 at night. The modules were demanding, with rigorous professors, dense content, and frequent evaluations. Madeline never complained. She had chosen this pace. She knew she wouldn't get much rest, but she also knew exactly where she wanted to go. Miles, who had already noticed her commitment, began paying closer attention. He saw the fatigue in Madeline's eyes, but also the unwavering focus she brought to even the most complex tasks. One morning, seeing her arrive 10 minutes early for a meeting with external engineers, he casually asked, "Did you sleep at all?" Madeline smiled as she organized her papers. Enough to keep going. It wasn't a flippant response, just honest. Miles didn't push further, but during the meeting, his gaze lingered on her more than once. It wasn't just because of the technical insights she offered. It was a quiet curiosity growing each day. Madeline, meanwhile, stayed focused. As much as their exchanged glances hinted at something beyond the professional, she knew this wasn't the time for distractions. Westbrook demanded her best, and so did Preston and Locke. Evening classes were a deep dive into topics that fascinated her: thermal comfort in low-income housing, regeneration of decayed urban areas, new low-impact construction materials. Madeline took notes feverishly, absorbed every concept, and tried to connect theory to the real-world projects she worked on. This bridge between academia and practice made her increasingly confident. On weekends, she reserved her mornings for Logan and afternoons for her school assignments. Her brother, fully aware of how much this meant to her, did his part without complaint. He kept the apartment running, cooked simple meals, and even urged her to take short breaks. "You still need to breathe," he'd say, handing her a cup of tea or opening a window to let in fresh air. It was the kind of support Madeline cherished, quietly dotted Preston and Locke. Her progress didn't go unnoticed. Brandon began assigning her more in-depth analyses. The materials coordinator requested her input on using flax fiber for ventilated facades, and Miles increasingly brought her into strategic discussions around the Green Horizon Initiative. Madeline didn't force herself into the spotlight, but she didn't shrink back either. When she had a suggestion, she voiced it. When she disagreed with a proposal, she explained her reasoning. That calm confidence stood out. But what struck Miles most was the lack of ego. Madeline didn't seem to seek validation. She worked with a clear sense of purpose, and that intrigued him. One Friday, after a particularly hectic day, he crossed paths with her in the lobby. She was on her way to the subway, her Westbrook books clutched to her chest. Miles walked with her to the sidewalk, "Got plans this weekend?" he asked. Madeline answered naturally, studying, "And maybe resting if there's time." He just nodded and watched her go, lingering outside longer than necessary before returning to his office. That night, Madeline returned home exhausted. She showered, had dinner with Logan, and before diving back into her assignments, sat on the couch for a moment doing absolutely nothing. She let her body relax, but her mind kept racing. She thought about how much had changed since her first day as a hostess at Preston and Locke. Now she held a technical role, was studying at one of the most respected schools in the country, and was finally being taken seriously as a professional. She felt proud, but also the weight of responsibility. None of it had been handed to her, and she didn't want it to be. As she finally stood to resume her reading, she glanced out the window. The city lights flickered as always. But inside her, everything felt clearer. Even without discussing it aloud, Madeline felt her connection with Miles deepening. There were no promises or suggestive remarks, just an increasingly clear sense that he saw her differently now. And while that didn't change how she behaved, it affected how she felt. Not out of fantasy, but because the respect, attentiveness, and quiet interest came consistently, tangibly. Madeline wasn't building up expectations, but she wasn't blind to the signs either. As she kept up her relentless routine, eyes fixed on the future and feet grounded in the present, she held on to one simple truth. Nothing could distract her now. Not even a feeling that, though still unspoken, was quietly growing between them, waiting for its own moment to be understood. The plan was to spend the evening studying, but in the late afternoon, Madeline received an email from Westbrook announcing that class had been canceled due to a campus power outage. The unexpected free time didn't seem like a reason to head home early. She stayed at Preston and Locke, taking advantage of the quiet office to organize notes for the Green Horizon Initiative and review her personal portfolio. As the city lights of Chicago began to glow beyond the tall windows, Miles passed by the project room and noticed she was still there. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment before she noticed. Then he stepped closer, resting a hand on the back of a chair. "You're still here?" he asked casually. Madeline glanced at the clock and smiled. "Class was canceled. Figured I'd get ahead on a few things." Miles nodded, then hesitated. "Have you eaten yet?" She shook her head. "Want to go out for a bit? Somewhere we can talk without rushing." The restaurant Miles picked was only a few blocks away, a small, warmly lit place with light wood tables and soft music that made conversation easy. At first, Madeline kept her usual polite distance. But as the meal progressed, the conversation grew more personal. They talked about their childhoods, what had led them to this point, about grief and fresh starts. Miles admitted that after years of living solely for work, he had been caught off guard when he saw in Madeline something he hadn't expected in a professional setting. Vitality, intelligence, and humanity all at once. Touched, Madeline looked away briefly. Miles leaned slightly across the table, and what came next felt natural. A brush of fingers, a quiet smile, and then a kiss, brief, calm, unforced. It wasn't impulsive or rehearsed. It simply made sense that in the days that followed, there were no declarations or promises, but the air between them had changed. Miles started picking her up after work some evenings, suggesting dinner before she headed to class. On weekends, when Madeline wasn't buried in assignments, they walked around the city, visited architecture exhibits, discovered quiet cafes tucked into unfamiliar neighborhoods. Their relationship unfolded without urgency or hesitation. Madeline, once guarded, found comfort in being with someone who respected her pace and boundaries. Miles, in turn, seemed to rediscover a softer, more present part of himself, one that had long been buried under layers of pressure and responsibility. Logan met Miles on a crisp Saturday in fall. Madeline was preparing a simple dinner when Miles arrived with a bottle of wine and a sci-fi novel for the teenager. The introduction started out formal, but soon grew more relaxed. Logan, observant as always, appreciated how Miles treated his sister with a mix of warmth, respect, and a kind of care that already felt familiar. Miles asked real questions, listened, and laughed at the quiet jokes that naturally came up between siblings. By the end of the evening, it was clear to Madeline, Miles wasn't just an occasional visitor anymore. He was becoming part of their life, quietly, but steadily. The following semester flew by. Madeline balanced work at Preston and Locke with her coursework at Westbrook, kept the apartment in order, and shared small but meaningful moments with Miles. On a cold morning in December, Logan graduated from high school. Madeline watched the ceremony with tears in her eyes, seated beside Miles. When Logan's name was called, Miles stood and applauded like family. Madeline squeezed his hand. She knew that, somehow, everything they had achieved so far was a result of her choices and of the support she now had. It was the close of one chapter that hadn't just depended on her, but had certainly started with her. That evening, she and Miles walked along the edge of the Chicago River. A light breeze played with her hair, and for a long time, they said nothing. They stopped by a bridge and watched the lights flicker across the water. When Miles finally spoke, his words were quiet but steady. "I like what we're building." Madeline looked at him for a moment, then leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me too," she said, "even though I never imagined we'd be here today." What they had wasn't built on grand gestures or promises. It was made of routine, respect, care, and a love that had grown quietly through admiration and become something they could finally see clearly. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time!